Good morning.
Good morning.
So, what does not criminally responsible mean?
Yeah. So not criminally responsible, or NCR as it's sometimes is called for short, it's a special kind of verdict that is basically an off-ramp from the regular justice system. So it's for people who, yes, they committed crimes, but they were essentially so mentally ill at the time that they maybe didn't realize what they were doing. So it kind of diverts them from that regular judicial process. So there's two factors that you have to prove to get that under the criminal code. One is that you actually had a mental disorder at the time of your offense or offenses. And the second is that that mental disorder had to have actually made you unable to understand either what you were doing or that it was wrong. So then if you get both of those and you are found NCR, not criminally responsible, you then go under the purview of what's called the Criminal Code Review Board. So often you're then in a secure psychiatric facility. Generally then it's up to that review board to determine what kind of freedoms you get, if any. To learn a little bit more about what that looks like, I talked to Brandon Trask. He's a former prosecutor who's appeared before that review board, and he's also an assistant professor at the U of M who teaches about mental health and the law. Here's how he describes it.
If somebody is experiencing delusions, specifically in the context of more of a paranoid schizophrenia, for instance, that individual may have an easier time making the case that they should be found NCR because, what they were doing was essentially not their own choice. They felt that they had to act in a certain way because they were receiving instructions to do so.
So in Manitoba, we might think about some of the more high-profile cases like Vince Lee. So he was found not criminally responsible after beheading Timothy McLean in an unprovoked attack on a Greyhound bus near Portage la Prairie in 2008. So psychiatric evidence at his trial showed that he's schizophrenic and that he suffered a major psychotic episode at the time of that attack. He was rehabilitated and eventually released. Now, that can happen if you're found not criminally responsible, but it's not always the case.
What do we know about what role this might play in Skibicki's trial?
So we don't know yet what the expert opinions are from the people who assessed his mental state or the details of the defense case regarding that yet. We'll learn more about that probably this week. Both sides we know have experts that have assessed Skibicki. We know though from his confession to police in 2022 that was captured on video, he told them that he has borderline personality disorder, that he's also been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and that he'd struggled with addictions. He said as well that he was coming down from doing mushrooms when he killed the first woman he's admitted to killing, and that he was on methamphetamine during the 3 other killings. So his argument could be linked to one of those, but according to Brandon Trask, that U of M professor we just heard from, it could also be because the defense sort of had no other choice, especially considering some of the evidence against him in the trial, including that police statement I just mentioned. So he confessed to all 4 killings, right? So that really could limit their possible arguments, and it would have been pretty hard for them, he says, to argue that Skibicki was not guilty.
One argument that was still remaining for them to make was in relation to the pursuit of this finding of NCR. And so, that the defense is pursuing that finding is interesting, perhaps not surprising given the evidence that was put forward by the Crown.
So basically he's saying that because Skibicki has admitted to killing all 4 women, the defense may have been kind of running out of options.
How does this compare to other cases involving serial killers?
So I also talked to John Bradford. He's the forensic psychiatrist who assessed a number of high-profile cases in Canada, including some serial killers. He says it's unusual to hear about a case like Skibicki's involving an argument that he's not criminally responsible. And Bradford says when he assessed some of those more high-profile cases, so like Paul Bernardo, for example, Robert Pickton, Russell Williams, he looked into whether any of them would qualify to be found not criminally responsible. And he said in each case, he found that they wouldn't, in part because of how much planning and organization goes into those kind of serial sexually motivated killings.
They have to find a victim, they have to persuade them and abduct them, and they have to go to various means to do that. And then usually afterwards there's some disposition of the body in a way to avoid to avoid being arrested or being found guilty. And all of that goes against, really, it's much more organized than, and again, I'm generalizing, when people are psychotic, they tend to be disorganized.
So I also talked to Anita Szigeti. She's a longtime mental health lawyer in Toronto who's been representing not criminally responsible clients for almost 30 years. She says those kinds of cases can involve serious crimes like homicides, and sometimes even more than one of them. And they can also involve crimes that were committed over a longer period of time. But she says usually those things don't go together, like the 4 homicides that Skibicki has admitted to over a 2-month period.
It would be extremely unusual to see an NCR verdict attaching to a period of time of offending that spans several weeks or months, where there are repeat offenses of extreme violence, such as homicide.
So, do we actually know if any serial killers in Canada have been found not criminally responsible?
So sort of not, at least not in the way that we know it now. So there are cases from decades ago, from before the current not criminally responsible law was brought in after a 1991 Supreme Court decision. One example is Peter Woodcock. So he was later known as David Kruger. He killed 3 young children in Toronto in the 1950s. And people like him at the time would have been found not guilty by reason of insanity, often because they'd been diagnosed with psychopathy, meaning they lack empathy or remorse. But the experts I talked to say that likely wouldn't happen today, in part because that diagnosis wouldn't qualify them for the criteria that are now needed to prove you're not criminally responsible, including, like we heard earlier, that your mental disorder had to have made you unable to understand that your actions were wrong. Here's what that Toronto lawyer Anita Szigeti says about that.
There's no question that they understood and had the capacity to understand the nature of their actions, either that they were sexually assaulting, usually women or children, or killing human beings. You have an acute awareness that your actions are wrong, but your lack of empathy that's linked to your psychopathy makes you not care.
But lots has changed since then, and we generally don't really see those kinds of offenders coming through the not criminally responsible system now.
So, Caitlyn, what is next in the trial of Jeremy Skibicki then?
So court is now scheduled to resume. We're not sure how much longer it'll go for. It's scheduled now to go until Thursday, but we'll sort of have to see how things go. We do expect to hear at least from both experts I mentioned earlier, so the one for the Crown and the one for the defense, who both assess Skibicki. Forensic psychiatrist Bradford says people often think about these kinds of court cases that they end up in what's called kind of a battle of the experts. But he says experts actually, in his experience, often agree on the diagnosis, but they disagree on some of the finer details.
What is more often the dispute is the impact on the person's state of mind at the time of the crime. It's more around the legal parameters that you get a disagreement, trying to interpret what we know from a psychiatric standpoint and how it affects somebody's mental functioning and how that may or may not fit the legal criteria.
In the coming days, the defense will then lay out the specifics of that case. Then it'll be up to the judge to decide.
Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.